What's up guys, and welcome back to another Yu-Gi-Oh video. So today's video is going to be something new. Basically, a guy on Instagram called Obsidian Cards asked if I could look over a few of the cards he's thinking of submitting to BGS and give them a kind of pre-grade to let him know how I think each card would do before he actually goes and sends them off. So I'll put a link down to his Instagram below if anyone's interested. He's got a pretty cool collection. But yeah, pretty much we're going to go over the 13 cards that he sent me in detail on each one, looking over how I think they're going to grade. So first up, we got a Master of Oz here. I have looked at the cards, by the way, briefly beforehand, just to kind of get a vague idea of how they look when I'm not looking at them through a camera, and also to clean off little bits of dirt and dust and things like that, which is always worth doing before you submit any kind of card, regardless of where you're looking to send it. So this is the Master of Oz. It's got great centering to begin with, definitely like within the 9.5 range. The front in general looks pretty good. I don't think there's a lot wrong with it in terms of the surface, but there's a little bit of whitening on the edge, so that's immediately going to knock the edges down, most likely to an 8.5, because it is quite obvious when you're just looking at the card head on. Aside from that, the front's pretty clean. The corners have a very small amount of whitening, but I reckon it's still within the 9 range for corners rather than 8.5. And then moving on to the back, obviously Soul of the Duelist always has a bit of waxing, and this card's no exception to that. It's pretty light as far as SOD goes, but it probably will knock the surface to an 8.5. Maybe a 9 if you're lucky, but I'd say most graders would give it an 8.5 because there is quite a lot of it. Aside from that, edges and corners are pretty good on this. I reckon you can definitely get at least, based on the back to be honest, it would be a 9 on edges and corners. The front will potentially bring the edges down to an 8.5. So overall, I'd say the Master of Oz is probably a strong 8.5, and it may have a chance for an overall 9 depending on how the edges do. Then we got one more ulti from Soul of the Duelist to go through. Another one of my favorite ultimates, both this and Master of Oz, just very nostalgic cards to me. I love the artwork and the kind of goofy feel that they have. This one, from what I recall, is a bit cleaner than the Master of Oz. The front is really pretty good. There's a tiny kind of fingernail indent there. It's small enough that I can imagine some graders might not even pick it up, but it probably will bring the surface down to at least a 9, maybe an 8.5 again, depending on how they treat it. Edges also have a bit of wear in the exact same spot, but it's definitely lighter on the Ajama King than it was on the Master of Oz. So I reckon the edges will get a 9 on this. I don't think it'll knock them down any further than that. And the corners on the front are clean. Back is actually very good for Soul of the Duelist. There's even less waxing than there was on the Ajama King. Sorry, on the Master of Oz. There's just a little bit of a strip, which you nearly always get with Soul of the Duelist, no matter how clean the card is. And some very light other scratches. But overall, I'd say the surface quality could probably get a 9 on this if it wasn't for that little indent. Bearing in mind the indent, I think the surface will probably get an 8.5. But the overall chances for a 9 look pretty good. Again, centering is fine on the card, and edges and corners are pretty much clean, aside from that very small amount of white. So if I was grading this, I'd probably say a 9 on centering, 9.5 corners, 9 on edges, and then maybe an 8.5 on surface. And I think overall it should manage to get a 9 some way or other. Alright, next up is a pretty cool card. This is a Europrint Water Dragon. But this is going to be one of the cards from this pile where, unfortunately, it's not going to be gradable. I'll go into why that is now. So when you haven't graded cards before, or you don't have a lot of experience, you don't necessarily know what to look out for in terms of things that will really hurt the grade on the card. When you're looking at this Water Dragon, the front is great. And in general, the card has pretty much no kind of play on it. There isn't really any whitening on the front. Back corners have a bit of whitening, but it's not too bad. And overall, you'd think that the card looks pretty gradable just from looking at it like this. Maybe like an 8.5 or a 9. But where you have to really be careful with any card, to be honest, is whether there's any kind of staining on the card. With this Water Dragon, it's not immediately obvious, but I did notice when I was looking at it before, within pretty much a few seconds of turning it over, that there's a couple of issues on the back. So first up, on this top edge, there's a bit of black here. And you would think that's just dirt when you're looking at it first, so it would be something you could take off. But unfortunately, when you flip the card over, yeah, it's in focus at the moment, you can see that that black actually goes into the edge. So I don't know if it's ink or some kind of like liquid dirt that got onto the card at some point, but either way, it has stained the edge. And then what's even worse is on this corner, which has a little bit of damage anyway. I'm not sure exactly what's happened. I don't think it's alteration. I don't think it's someone trying to cover up the whitening. But you can see some slightly off color on the corner there. And if I flip it over to the edge, you should be able to see there's a pretty big kind of reddish pink stain going into the side of the card here. And maybe even a little bit visible from the top as well, but mostly on that side. So that's the kind of damage, whether it's inking or anything else, that will really stop a card being gradable if the grader sees it. So there's always a chance you get lucky, and this card would probably get an 8.5 if the grader didn't see that damage. But if they do see the staining on the edge, that's pretty much immediately going to ruin the card. I'm not sure what grade BGS would give it. Probably something like a 4 on edges or something like that because they're stained. Maybe even just an authentic altered if they get a really harsh grader. But yeah, that kind of card, it's a great binder card, but definitely not worth submitting. Alright, next up is a Thunder Giant. Now, I actually sold this card to Matt, Obsidian Cards, a few months back. I was thinking about grading it myself, but I think I needed some money for something or other, so I just decided to sell it raw instead. This is a really, really clean card. The front is pretty much flawless. There's maybe the tiniest dot of white up here, but edges and corners should be a 9.5 on this for sure. The centering is pretty off. I do think most likely it's an 8.5 on centering. Maybe a 9 if you get a nice grader though, because there's always that kind of range of possibilities with BGS on centering. The back of the card is really clean as well. I think there's the tiniest kind of little, almost like an indent right near the top, but it's extremely light. So the surface maybe will be knocked to a 9, depending on how the grader sees it. But overall, I'd say this card pretty much is gem mint, aside from that centering. And I'd expect it to get a 9 with like 8.5 centering, 9.5 edges and corners, and then probably a 9 on surface. Alright, next up is a big hitter. When I first looked at this, I thought the front looked really nice on this Black Rose Dragon. There's a few light hollow scratches, but it almost looks like the kind of card that could get a 9. The only real issue on the front, aside from those very light scratches, is if you look up in the top right region of the card, this is a very common issue with the North American print of the Ghost Rare Black Rose Dragon. There's kind of like some rust-colored spots. And at first sight, you might think that's dirt, but you should be able to see when I shine the light over that region of the card that it's actually underneath the surface of the card, which means it's a printing defect. And it's a very common one with this card. I'm not sure what exactly causes it, but you often get these kind of rusty brown colored spots in various places on Black Rose Dragon. Back of the card, again, there's not a lot of play, but if you look at the top edge, there's definitely a fair amount of whitening all the way along. So that's going to knock the edge grade right down to probably around a 7 or a 7.5. And the corners have a little bit of stuff going on with them as well. It's not too bad, but there's kind of some softness. And then the main issues with the card, if I'm remembering right, yeah, it's got this indent here on the surface, kind of like a deep scratch or some kind of pressure mark on the edge. So overall, bearing the various defects that this card has in mind, I would say it's probably not worth grading. Centering is fine. Centering should be probably a 9.5. But all three of the other subgrades may be affected by the damage. So depending on how they see the corners, they may get something like an 8.5. The surface will probably get something like a 7, and the edges again will be around a 7 to a 7.5. So I'd say overall you would not expect a BGS grade higher than a 7.5 on this card. Which honestly I would never really bother grading anything at BGS if you're not at least going to be able to get that silver label, which is an 8.5. Maybe a really high-end card like a prize card is still worth grading below that, but other than that, there's just very little interest from buyers on the market for BGS slabs below 8.5. This next card is another Ghost Rare, and this one's really nice, this Rainbow Neos. First edition from Phantom Darkness. This is not an easy card to grade, and this one's in awesome shape. If you're being critical, there's a couple of very light scratches on the foil, but to be honest, this is about as good as it gets. There's no factory lines or anything like that. I'd say surface is at least a 9 going by the front. Edges and corners are almost clean on the front. There's a little bit of factory silvering. I'm not sure how well it shows on camera. Just right at the bottom, which could knock the edges to a 9, but to be honest, bearing in mind how clean the rest is, and also how clean the back of the card is for edges and corners, which they're pretty much flawless, I do think this card can get 9.5s on both of those categories. And then the back surface has some minor waxing at the top. Not too bad, just again, that little strip that you often get from the factory. Aside from that, some really light scratching on the back, but nothing too bad. So I pretty much expect this card to get either a very strong 9 or a 9.5. I think centering should be good enough for a 9.5. Edges and corners, again, should be good enough for a 9.5. Maybe a 9 on edges from a harsh grader because of that silvering. And then the surface, most likely, bearing in mind the light hollow scratches and then the waxing on the back, would be a 9. But that means it has an overall great shot for a 9.5, which would be a really cool grade on this card. Next up, we have another one of those kind of cards, which are an example of cards you probably shouldn't grade. This Jinzo is pretty much pack fresh, but you can see right away when we start looking over it, it's got a deep dent. I'm not really sure. I'd say that's too big to call it a pin dent. It's pretty much just a dent on the front there, just next to the text box. And then it also has, you can see the back, by the way, is super clean. So it's pretty unfortunate. But the corner up here is also kind of a little bit mangled. It's just been dinged at some point, and unfortunately it's left a white line. So both the corner grade and the surface grade on this are going to get hammered because of those two defects. So even though the rest of the card is really nice, like 9+ quality, both the corner and the surface subgrades probably won't get above a 7.5 or maybe an 8 if you're lucky, which again means that the overall grade can't be higher than that. Especially for corners, it's very hard to drag up the corner grade of a card. So if a card gets a 7 on corners or a 7.5 on corners, even if the other subgrades are like 9.5, 10, it still will not get higher than a BGS 8 overall. Oops, sorry folks, the camera cut out there. But yeah, I was just going to say, again, this Jinzo makes a great binder card, but kind of like the Water Dragon we looked at earlier, I would not send it in for grading because of those two defects. Next up's a really cool card. I don't think I've ever held one of these in person before. It's a DR04 Secret Rare Satellite Cannon. Pretty rare set to come by the Secret Rares of. This one's pretty clean. If we drop the card there. The front is great. Centering's pretty good. The back does have those, I think, a few issues. If you look up here, there's kind of like a thumbnail indent. And there's another, I'm not sure exactly what's going on down there, but kind of some sort of pressure mark or dent, both there and there. Edges and corners are solid, so I think it can get an okay overall grade because the centering should probably be a 9. Edges and corners can probably get 9 or 9.5, and then the surface will get definitely a lower grade, but as long as it can get a 7.5 on surface, that would be an overall 8.5, which would still be pretty good. So I'd say this one is just about worth sending in. Probably not at the moment since they're only offering premium, which is $250 a card. But when they open up a bulk tier service, this is the kind of card that's still just about worth submitting because those other 3 subgrades will drag out the surface. Next up, we have a bit of old school action with a Kuribo first edition from MRD. Really nice centering for a Kuribo. It's one of the less well centered cards from MRD, I would say. Edges and corners, again, are actually really clean too, both on the front and back. And the surface has, I think, just a few light scratches, maybe a tiny bit of waxing as well. So the surface may get knocked to a 9 because of those slight defects, but I do think all 3 of the other categories can get 9.5. And so far, this is probably the best candidate we've looked at for getting an overall 9.5 grade. Then moving to a much newer card, we have a Dark Magician Girl the Dragon Knight, first edition secret rare. This one's a North American print, which look pretty different actually to the European prints for this era of cards. The European ones are much glossier on the front. They have a lot of foil bleed as well and stuff like that. But yeah, in terms of condition, this card's pretty clean. It's not pack fresh. There are some light scratches on the back, just a the odd scuff here and there. A little bit of whitening, I think, up there and possibly on some of the other corners as well. So I think the card is not going to get a gem. It probably can get a 9 overall. Centering should be able to get a 9.5. Corners, probably a 9, maybe an 8.5 from a harsh grader. Surface, most likely a 9, and I think the edges can get a 9 or a 9.5. We're getting near the end here. We've got 3 cards left to look over. This one's a really cool card, very big hitter. It's a European print, first edition Ultimate Rare Flame Wingman. Awesome card to look at. One of my favorite Ultimate Rares from the whole GX era. And also one of the cards where I think the European print looks just so much better than the North American one. Centering wise, the card's pretty good. Probably a 9.5 centering, definitely at least a 9. And the front in general doesn't have anything wrong with it, to be honest. The edges and corners on the front are amazing. Surface has probably a few light scratches, but again, at least a 9 quality. The back is pretty clean as well. Maybe a few light scratches here and there, but definitely really solid. Edges and corners on the back are what lets it down, which is nearly always the case for European print Ultimate Rares, unfortunately. But to be honest, they're not bad at all as far as it goes. Little bit of whitening, both on the corners and on the edges. But I do think this card has a solid chance for a 9 overall. Surface and centering should be 9s, and then both corners and edges probably could get 8.5s from harsher graders. But I think there's a pretty good chance that at least one of them lands a 9, which then puts it as an overall BGS 9. So that would be awesome. Definitely a card that's worth submitting. And we got a couple more European Ultimate Rares to round off the submission. First up is a Skyscraper. This card, I would honestly say, is pack fresh. Super, super clean. No surface issues at all. And the centering is good too. Definitely good enough for a 9 at least. On the back, there's a little bit of edge wear. A couple of kind of more noticeable dots over here, which is just to do with the factory cutting. With that brittle European cardstock, you often just get chips coming off the edges right from the moment they're cut before they even go in the pack. So grading a gem is more or less impossible from this kind of card. Honestly, the Skyscraper is about as good as it gets on the corners. So I'd say the corners can get a 9, maybe even a 9.5. Surface can get a 9, probably not a 9.5 thanks to the slight ultimate square, but it's really nice. And edges probably will get knocked to an 8.5 thanks to those little bits of whitening, but that would still leave it as an overall 9. So it's another one of those cards where the value probably isn't high enough to send it at the moment, but sending it at a later date when there are lower service tiers available could definitely be a decent idea. Alright, the camera cut out one last time, but I reckon we should be good to go to get this finished in this take. So yeah, the final card is an Elemental Hero Blade Edge. Euro print again, so you can see it's got that awesome foiling on it. The front of this card is really nice, like with a lot of European Ultimates. Centering is decent as well, probably a 9.5, for sure at least a 9. There's a little whitening on the corner, which that by itself would not knock the grade too much, probably a 9 on corners. But the back corners do have some more significant whitening. You can see up on that corner is probably the worst. But pretty much all 4 of the corners on the back have a little bit of white. And the top edge has some whitening as well. Not as bad, but I'm still not sure if the edge could get a 9. Corners are definitely no higher than an 8.5, and to be honest, probably could get something more like an 8 instead. Surface has some light scratching, but not too bad. It has some anti-stamp as well, so combining the scratching and the stamping, probably an 8 to an 8.5 on surface, I would say. So yeah, overall, this card's kind of, I'd say, borderline worth grading. Definitely not worth sending with any kind of express service. It's most likely going to get an 8.5 overall with kind of medium subgrades, maybe a couple of 9s, but probably nothing too crazy. So I'm not sure if it's worth grading, but it's not out of the question like something more like the Black Rose Dragon or the Water Dragon, where it's clearly not worth grading. This one could do okay, but I don't think it would do spectacularly, and I don't think it would get a 9. So yeah, that brings us to the end of the preview, guys. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. Hope it gave you a bit of insight into the grading process and kind of learning how to preview your own grades. And with that being said, we've reached the end of the video, so this is Schlost signing out, and I hope you guys all have a great day.